Okay, hello. So we're ready to go. Starting momentarily. Just make sure everything's correct here. Got got our little friend here. Okay, lighting seems a bit weird, but I think it's sunlight coming in is a bit diffuse today. Okay. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Okay, so last week I gave a talk on the materialist or annihilationist view, and this week I'm going to do the other end of the spectrum, the eternalist view. These two views are called by the Buddha the extreme views, and his teaching is said to be in the middle between the two, the middle path or the middle way, based on the dependent origination. Um, it seems that in the world, the eternalist view and the materialist view are always at loggerheads. And we can see this throughout history that these seem to be the two dominant views in much of the world, not just the West, but also in India. These variations of these views were common. But from the Buddhist point of view, uh, although these views are extreme opposite ends of a philosophical spectrum, they do share one flaw in that they deny, at some point, they break down and deny causality. The principle of dependent origination says that everything arises from a cause and nothing arises without a cause. So uh, this precludes, if we hold to um, this principle of dependent origination, it precludes any randomness or arbitrariness in the way the world functions. The materialist view that we covered last week falls back always on randomness. Uh, in the end, it has to just fall back on that, well, that's the way it is. It just works that way. Whereas in the eternalist view, um, they have the idea of what Aristotle called the causeless cause, that there's a first principle outside of causality that is usually, not always, but usually personified as a god. Whether it's the Christian God or whether it's Brahma or Pajapati, it's the same idea that there's some being outside of time and space who created everything. This is called the eternalist view. It usually goes along with the idea of beings being imbued with an immortal principle, an unchanging principle. In India, this was the Atman. In the West, they might call it the soul. In the Bhagavad Gita, the Atman is described as being the unchanging principle inherent in every individual that transmigrates from life to life. And when someone dies, the metaphor is used just like a man undressing, going to bed, and in the morning he gets up and puts on a fresh suit of clothes, uh, taking on a new body, a new birth. Whereas Buddhism not only has the idea of uh, causality, it also has the principle of impermanence, that nothing persists, everything is subject to change, and also the principle of anatta, uh, the selfless nature of everything, the impersonal nature, or more technically, the insubstantial nature of everything. There is no essence to anything. So that's sort of the framework context within the relationship of these three views. So let's focus on the eternalist view. The eternalist view requires some kind of arbitrary will of the creator, and you can always fall back on the answer, that's the way God did it, or that's the ways of God are mysterious. Philosophically, there are big problems with the creationist or eternalist view. I think the principal one is what the Christians call the problem of evil, that they've never resolved. This is the problem that if God is all powerful, and if he's also benevolent, why is there suffering in the world? Why not just human beings being evil, but also impersonal suffering, like cancer or even old age and death? Why are these things in the world if God is all powerful and benevolent? There's in Christian theology, there's actually a whole branch of theology that's called theodicy, Theodicy, that is devoted to discussing this problem. So and this is, of course, 2,000 years old that they've been working on it. There's no definitive answer to that question. So I think that really is very problematic. Of course, one could postulate a deity that is either not all powerful or not benevolent. Certainly, if there was this is a variation of this would be the Gnostic. The Gnostic view of things, which isn't an old attempt to try and resolve the problem, but it doesn't really. Their position, and there's various versions of Gnosticism, it's not just one system, but their basic idea is there is a good, benevolent God, but the creation isn't done all at once. It comes down through various stages, levels of supernatural beings, and somewhere down the chain there's a God that or a lesser God that is basically evil. They sometimes call him the demiurge, and he's the one who created the material world. But still, that if the top God is all powerful, how does he let this flaw get into his system? So it's a difficulty I don't think that eternalism can really get around. I think for someone who's used to the Buddhist way of thinking, the whole idea of anything persisting unchanged eternally seems peculiar, if not impossible. It just doesn't seem uh, to work. The idea that beings have uh, a soul or an atman that never changes. No, how could something persist without change? No, moment to moment, we can see just in our experiences introspectively. We can see that the experience of consciousness is different in each moment. We're taking different objects, and our tone of mind is changing constantly. So to find some principle that never changes, we can look and look. We'll never really find anything like that. The eternalist view, I would say, though, in comparison to the materialist view, uh, it does have an advantage in terms of practical application, in that it is a better foundation for ethics. If um, people believe in a God that metes out rewards and punishments, that'd be a motivation to behave properly. Whereas there isn't really an underlying reason um, to keep an ethical system under materialism. Under the middle view, the Buddhist view, of course, there's the principle of karma, that all actions have consequences. And this is an extension of dependent origination, that nothing arises without a cause, so that there's a constant interplay of cause and effect. And one of the causes is volitional action of beings. The eternalist view also has, I would say, another philosophical problem, in that it has to postulate a first beginning. And this seems to be a, a difficulty that uh, kind of falls outside of the range of logical or rational thought, that there could possibly be a first instant. I know some people, when they first approach the Buddhist idea of beginningless time without a beginning, they find that difficult uh, to understand. For some reason, our mind more easily understands endless time in the forward direction, but um, it's difficult to grasp beginningless time. Schopenhauer dealt with this question. He said it's if you're going to. Schopenhauer knew quite a bit about Buddhism. He said that if you're going to uh, accept the principle of causality, you can't make an exception to it. And a beginning of time would have to be an exception to cause and effect, because the first instant would have to be without a cause, or it was created by a deity that is himself without a cause. So there's uh, an exception or a breakdown in cause and effect. We're getting outside of, we're getting into a kind of magical thinking. There's an interesting note on the eternalist view it occurs a couple of places in the canon, but I think the most complete explanation is in the Brahmajala Sutta, Digha Nikaya 1, where it talks about how the eternalist view arises in the world. When a new world system comes into being, which is said to be by the force of the karma of the beings expiring in the old world system, when the new world system comes into being, it comes into being from the top down. First the higher Brahma worlds manifest, and then it gradually manifests lower and lower levels. And at some point, there arises in a Brahma world, the first being to arise in that Brahma world is a Mahabrahma, the great Brahma. And for a long time, he's alone in that world. And he has no conception of anything outside of his world. And he begins to have a wish for companions to arise. And then by the force of their own karma, other beings, lesser beings, arise in that world in his presence. And he believes that he's created them by his wish. And he tells them that, and they believe it. They believe they are his creations. And at some future time, after a long period of time, because these beings have very long lifespans, one of them expires from that world and is reborn as a human being and takes up the practice of meditation or yoga, and acquires some fragmentary memories of his life in the Brahma world. And he sees them as visions of heaven, and it is seen as a revelation. And he goes forth and teaches others about the great creator of the universe, the great Brahma. So it's a view, according to this story, it's not a view that's just made up artificially or just out of someone's imagination. It's based on an actual memory or vision of life in the Brahma world. So that's quite interesting, that it's then perceived as a divine revelation. So it's a confused interpretation of a genuine vision. Another place this idea comes up is in the sutta in the Majjhima Nikaya, where the Buddha goes up to the realm of Baka, the Brahma. And it's quite significant. When the Buddha first approaches Baka, one of the Brahma's attendants calls out the epithets or titles of the great Brahma Baka. And it sounds very much like a description of the Christian or Old Testament God. He is the great one. He is the All-Father. He is the maker of all that is and will be. He is the great judge, and so forth. Lists out all these titles of Baka. We should also, when we're discussing the eternalist view, we should also bear in mind that this is a broad category, that there are many variations within the eternalist view. In India, in the Upanishads, there came to be a philosophical idea that the Atman equals Brahma, or the Atman is Brahma. And what this means is that this is sometimes called the one mind idea, that Brahma is the only mind that exists, the great Brahma, so God. And all the beings that are individual in the world, all the humans and animals and devas and everything else, are like fragments of Brahma. and it's like his consciousness is looking out through all these little windows, and the Atman, that was an older idea that is now subsumed into the concept of Brahma, the one consciousness. I have heard speculation that this isn't from the suttas, but it's a modern it's a modern monk. I remember commenting on this, that he thought very likely that this particular view arose from some in a similar way to uh, the idea of the creator God, in that someone had a confused interpretation of a meditation experience. In this case, either realizing in meditation or remembering a past life in the plane of infinite consciousness, boundless consciousness, which is the uh, second formless jhana. So, be that as it may, the problem with that Upanishadic view from the Buddhist point of view is it's still a self view or a substantialist view. Now, we could say the older Indian view had a multiplicity of selves, and the Upanishads reduced it to one, and the Buddhists came along and reduced it to zero. Consciousness is seen as insubstantial. It's a process. It's not an object. It's not a self. It has no substance. Uh, of course, in the West, the monotheistic view became dominant for a long time, and is still very strong. It probably, the first actual version of it was probably in Persia with the Zoroastrians, um, but it's expressed in the religions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and they all share the idea of a one God monotheistic religion as a creator. But there are wide-ranging different interpretations. Within Christianity, there is a division between Latin and Greek Christianity, or Catholic and Orthodox, that have quite a different view of God. In the Latin view, Saint Thomas Aquinas, in his Summa Theologica, was very particular about details about the nature of God. It was a lot of discussion. This is the whole intellectual field of theology, the study of God. Whereas in the East, they had what they call an apophatic view of God, in that God is beyond our comprehension, beyond our reason, and we can't attribute attributes to him. We can't describe him in any way. I once visited a Eastern Orthodox church, and the central part of the building was a dome, and the walls all around were covered in quite colorful and beautiful imagery, icons of various kinds, except the very top of the dome was left blank. And I was told by a priest there that the reason for that is that God cannot be represented. He's apophatic. So this, actually, the Eastern Orthodox version probably approaches closest of any of the monotheist views to the Buddhist understanding of the ultimate principle, the unconditioned. Nibbana is beyond our reason and our discussion. The difference, of course, is that we don't see Nibbana as a person, and we don't see it as a cause. We don't see it as a creator of anything. It's outside of cause and effect. It's the only principle that's outside of causality. It's beyond conditionality. So it doesn't really have a role in the conditioned world as such. There's an essay by, maybe I'll conclude with this. There was an essay by Maurice Walsh, who's probably best known as a translator of the Digha Nikaya. He wrote a number of independent essays that are quite good. He's talking about these different views, and he made an interesting point, I thought. That he said that the Buddhist view, compared to the other two, is like an island in the middle of a lake. And he said there's a optical illusion if you have a circular lake with an island in the middle. If you stand on the northern shore and look at the island, it looks to be closer to the southern shore. If you circle around and stand on the southern shore and look at the island, it appears to be closer to the northern shore. And he said it's like that with the extreme views. Someone with a materialist view looks at Buddhism. If they're a materialist, they think of themselves as scientific, rationalistic, and so on. And they look at Buddhism and compare it to other religions, and they say, well, it's a little bit different, but it's pretty much the same thing. They still have belief in metaphysical principles, and it's just it's not that different from other religions. Then you circle around to the Eternalist side of the lake, and you stand with the theologians, and you look at the Buddhist island, and it appears to be not that different from materialism. And this is actually the some years ago, under the previous pope, there was a document that was issued critiquing Buddhism, and their position is that Buddhism is essentially nihilism. It doesn't really because it doesn't believe in God. It really doesn't believe in anything, and it's basically an atheistic materialist philosophy, and it's understandable how they could see that coming from where they are. So it's kind of important to remember that Buddhism stakes out an independent position that's not part of either one of those camps. So I'll stop there, and I can see that the chat is very busy. Let me scroll back to see what we got for questions, so what I can deal with here. How does the creator God work in Brahmanic tradition, since apparently they also believed in universe expansion and contraction model found in Buddhism? Well, there's not one singular view in India in the Brahmanic tradition. There were different views and interpretations. In the Vedic period, which the earliest version, there's a myth of a great sacrifice that, and again, there's a couple of different versions of this, but one god, probably Pajapati is usually named, was sacrificed. He willingly allowed himself to be sacrificed, and the other gods made like the mountains out of his bones and the oceans out of his blood and so on. Of course, this is a very kind of primitive view, and there's very similar, probably the same origin, very similar myth in Norse mythology, but it's not philosophically sophisticated. But then you have the idea later of Brahma as the great God, the great creator, and the expansion and contraction of the universe is seen as the breath of Brahma, breathing in, breathing out. I think in the most sophisticated uh, Brahmanist view, I stand to be corrected on this. I'm not dead sure, but I think they would also agree with Buddhism in that the universe is beginningless. That Brahma has always been breathing in and out. Okay, next one. In description of most eternal heavens and hells, often speech, pleasure, and pain are common occurrence, which implies things are in motion, which is only possible though. Uh, uh, I don't. I think that's cut off somehow there, but that's yeah. That again, there are different views within eternalist systems of the afterlife. Um, I know one of the more sophisticated Christian views is that one is in heaven. One is eternally bathing in the what they call the beatific vision. It's like which is again a parallel to Indian view. The Buddhists' uh, view of Brahma is the sight of Brahma, the vision of Brahma in his palace is the most beautiful sight in the universe. So that might have that connection there. Um, I think you know more philosophically sophisticated Christians began to have issue with the whole idea of a heaven where one's eternally existing in just a kind of a very pleasant earth-like existence. It doesn't seem to doesn't seem to really make sense when you think of it. Of course, in Buddhism, there's no eternal. There's heaven and there's hell, but they're not eternal. One goes there and spends a period of time and is reborn elsewhere. Oh, I see. This continues, and that question continued. He says that okay, I'm going to read the last bit again, which is only possible through passage of time, and this by default subject those realms to change. Pleasure and pain arise and fall away on previous causing conditions, which are therefore impermanent phenomena, making them ultimately dukkha and anatta, much like here. So the question is, how can you simultaneously be subject to time and not undergo change? By logic, you can't. Yes, very good. Yeah, that the idea of an eternal existence still subject to change is not really philosophically uh, um, sustainable. Also, you think it would eventually get boring. Doesn't evil only exist because humans are around to observe it? Otherwise, without our human perception of evil, wouldn't there just be natural processes occurring? Yeah, that's a good point. It's our judgment from our point of view that we can call something good or evil, which are actually kind of concepts that good and evil are concepts that don't really sit well with Buddhism. Ethical principles are, when we're being more technical, are called skillful and unskillful, kusala and nakusala. But what can in a more broader sense of uh, things that exist in the world that we might label as evil. Like I gave the example of cancer. From the point of view of a cancer cell, it's not evil. It's just doing its thing. It's just a natural existence. But from position of a human being. It's an evil, an undesirable cause of suffering. So yeah, it is somewhat ultimately subjective, and um, depends on the point of view of the observer. Next, Ajahn Tanisaro says that it's not the Buddha taught that there isn't something eternal, because only says sankhara are anicca. He says eternalism specifically is talking about being an eternal self. Do you agree? Um, no, I actually don't. I'm not. I don't really agree with uh, Tanisaro's Ajahn Tanisaro's interpretation of. I know what you're referring to, and I don't really agree. I think his interpretation shades off into eternalism. Um, Nibbana is outside of change. It's not anicca, but it's all, by that principle, it's outside of time. So it's not eternal. The Buddha never applied that to Nibbana. He said Nibbana is non-dying, amata. It's not born, not dying, ajata amata. If he wanted to say it was eternal or everlasting, he would have used nitya, but that's never used. Uh, Next question. Hey, I always wondered how any intelligent design or cosmic laws of the universe, such as karma, were possible without a creative intelligence at the ground of all being. Um, yeah, uh, that could be a whole discussion about intelligent design and creationism. Uh, and I think that again, the Buddhist view is somewhat of a middle path. There does seem to be an order in things, and this is something that if you have seen any of the writings of proponents of the idea of intelligent design, which is a more sophisticated kind of creationism, if they'll point out things like the great complexity of a cell, that there's actually a very good book that I've read called The Signature of the Cell, written by an intelligent design proponent. Um, or no, The Signature of the Cell, it's called. But where I think that there's what we could say is that it seems clear there's some kind of uh, teleology present. I wouldn't say it's necessarily designed, but there's a teleology, which uh, Darwinian evolution denies that there could possibly be any teleology. If you're not familiar with that word, it means that there's a direction or a movement towards, like there's a forward direction to things. So life becomes more sophisticated and complex. Uh, not through just random mutation, but there seems to be an underlying force. But I think you could also observe the fossil record and even the design of living beings and see that it's not, although there's some broadly speaking intelligence present, the consciousness is moving. I would say it's consciousness blindly moving towards a more perfect vehicle. And there's an impulse in consciousness wanting to express itself in a better vehicle. If things were designed intelligently, then if there was some designer, a god behind everything, why was there long ages when there were things like trilobites and dinosaurs, and then these designs were scrapped, and then we get something else. We get mammals and eventually humans. You know? if you're going to take a creationist view, something like the story in Genesis would make more sense, that God created everything in its final form all at once. But that's obviously wrong according to the what we can see in the fossil record. So yeah, I think that could be a whole long discussion. But to sum it up, I would say that there is some, in my view, my interpretation of things, I would say there is some kind of a underlying, you could call it intelligence. I think more technically accurate would be a teleology of consciousness, moving in kind of blind fits and starts, and sometimes going down the wrong direction, and then struggling out of that into something else. Okay, next one. Time is change. The theory of eternalism combined with the occurrence of phenomena in complete disagreement with the laws of nature and roots from our failure to understand true infinity. Okay, yeah, okay, I see that. It's a good point. I know it's speculation, but do you think Jesus Christ came into contact with a Brahma god who was himself deluded and believed he was almighty, and this is what he taught to Jesus Christ? As for Jesus Christ, first of all, it's we don't really know much about him. Even the idea whether he existed or not at all historically is debated. Um, I personally think he probably did. Uh, I wouldn't say it's possible. Your idea of him in being contacted either this in that life or in a previous life with a Brahma realm might be one interpretation. Um, I've had the idea that if Jesus Christ in the Gospels, if that's actually if we can count on that as historically accurate, then it's possible he's a bodhisattva, that he's on his way to become a Buddha, and I could see that story of Jesus being a Jataka story in some future universe. True infinity is not just a very large number, so totality of space and time of all possibilities existing simultaneously, just as two comprise one. Infinite compromises all that cannot be pinpointed in a single location. It's the sum of all locations. Much like zero or nothing, where all possibilities ever to take place, none is taking place, which also cannot be pinpointed to a single location. And it is the sum of an infinitude of possibilities not manifesting, therefore it is also ultimately unbound. I think zero and infinite are two sides of the same coin. What are your thoughts, dear Ajahn? Yes, yeah. Just to take your last statement there, zero and infinite are two sides of the same coin. I think that's the real meaning of sunyata, the emptiness. I like to think of it as a infinite potential, because it's void, because nothing is manifest, anything is possible. And once something is manifest, then it's imperfect, it's a broken bit, and this is dukkha. Uh, let's see. And Nagarjuna argues in MMK that things don't really arise from themselves, from another, both, or neither. I've heard some other Indian philosophers say causality is an illusion, and ultimately it's all happening due to God. Do you think this is just a less sophisticated way to say what Nagarjuna said? Because it seemed like on both ends it just breaks down to incomprehensibility. Yeah, I've read some Nagarjuna. I'm not really an expert in his philosophy, and it is intriguing. He um, he critiques the whole idea of causality as expressed in Abhidhamma. Um, and he, from a logical philosophical point of view, he makes some his arguments are pretty sound as far as I've seen them. Uh, and he wants to bring you all in my reading of him, which, as I say, I'm not an expert. I could be off, but my reading of him, he always wants to bring you back to not getting caught in logical systems, but to fall back onto the idea of voidness, emptiness. He wasn't in any way a theist. I'm sure of that. Saint John of the Cross is an interesting apophatic Christian. Currently reading his Ascent of Mount Carmel. There's quite a bit of similarities to Buddhist thought. Yeah, another one is what's his name? Uh, One who wrote the Cloud of Unknowing. Meister Eckhart. It's another Christian mystic. It's difficult to understand rebirth without the idea of an eternal soul. Yeah, what? Yeah, this is the perennial question. What is it that experiencing the consequences of action? Is it not some type of self? What am I missing here? Yeah, this is this question as old as the Buddha. It comes up again and again in slightly different forms. How can it be rebirth without a self? Um, and the question is based ultimately on a misunderstanding um, of of reality in this life. Um, there's a continuity of cause and effect in this life, but there's no abiding self continuing from moment to moment. If you assume that, then understanding rebirth becomes seems to require that something transmigrating, so kind of a self or soul. Um, no, we have a stream of consciousness in this life, moment after moment, but there's no continuity of substance. And it's the same with after birth, after death. There's a break in the physical, a total break in the physical continuity, but each mind moment is arising afresh, taking as one of its causes the previous mind moment. But because it hasn't got a body to fall back on, it has to find another place to arise. In Anguttara Nikaya, the Buddha speaks of the unfathomable amount of debt one is owed towards their parents, pertaining to parents who do not share the belief in Dhamma and follow eternalism. How does one go about speaking the Dhamma nearby while paying respect? Now, I wouldn't, challenge their views. Um, if you can find a, a way to communicate with them within their view, without challenging their view, because there's not, people who hold the eternalist view, good Christians are they're good people, and as I said, it's a sound basis for ethics, and they can have a quite profound spiritual life, even holding on to the eternalist view. But it's from the Buddhist point of view, it's incomplete. Uh, it's not going to liberate them finally from suffering. But you don't need to. I don't think you need to try and convert people to the Buddhist view if they're good people and living a decent life within their system. Then you should respect that. Did the Buddha ever mention any of the suttas definitive end or termination for the universe, realms, or parinirvana for all beings? No, no. The Buddha refused actually to answer the question of whether the universe is eternal or whether it's finite, either in space or time. It was one of the Abhyakata Dhammas, one of the questions he refused to answer. But the later commentators, like Buddhaghosa, were quite. They did answer it. Buddhaghosa states definitively that the universe is without beginning and without end. And also spatially. Uh, so, kind of referring to one of the previous questions or comments about infinity. It doesn't matter how many beings enter nirvana, there's still an infinite number of beings left. Whatever you subtract from an infinity is still an infinity. Are kusa and akusa determined solely by what takes one closer or further away from nirvana? Ultimately, yes, but there's a kind of a mundane level of kusala and akusala that could be defined as what causes or um, more suffering and what causes less suffering for self and others. Okay, I'm going to just take maybe one or two more here. Let's see. You might find Fred Hoyle's book, The Intelligent Universe of Interest, a rather novel thesis. He likes taking the data and getting as creative and original with it as he could. I'm not aware of that book. I'm aware. I've heard of Fred Doyle. I should look that up. Thank you. Okay, let's see. Okay, well, last one. Without beings or souls in an ultimate reality view, then how do Buddhists explain what is wrong to hurt or kill? Because of First Noble Truth, suffering is real, and causing suffering is wrong. There is pain, but there's no ultimately no being that suffers pain. But uh, but pain is real and it's experienced. So it's a subtlety, but it's an important one. Um, the emptiness and not self view can be abused uh, to promote a kind of immorality. And one historical example of this is from Japan, that some of the samurai who were followers of Rinzai Zen, they took it to the interpretation that it's all right for them to kill, because when they run their sword through someone's neck, cut off his head, nothing is happening except empty atoms passing through empty atoms, which from a strictly technical point of view, that's you can't that's actually true, but it's lacking compassion, and it's lacking a recognition of the actual conscious experience of suffering. Okay, so I'll stop there, and this will be my last stream for a little while. I'm going on retreat for the month of April, and so I won't be doing any streams in April, but I'll start again in May, and I'll see you then. And thank you all for coming and taking an interest in these topics, thinking about them. So we'll see you again in May, and I hope you all have a good month.